All right, so the Sony PlayStation drama kind of continues. And so, if you hadn't heard, recently some higher ups at PlayStation have said that the PlayStation 5 is in its latter stages of its life cycle. This obviously has a lot of people worried and confused, where it really feels like we haven't gotten a lot of games, and it feels like this console is really just beginning. And to be honest, PlayStation revealed why they feel this way. And why they feel this way is that they're not making enough money. That's honestly what it comes down to. And specifically that they're not selling the amount of consoles that they were hoping to, and they're not selling the amount of games they were hoping to. And for me, this is pretty baffling. One, because the console is selling extremely well, and even it's pretty obvious to everybody that PlayStation has won the console war that was going on a while ago, and they have a pretty heavy-handed market on the gaming industry. Xbox is even aware of this, and we've had them come out and essentially talk about how they're focused on making games and bringing those games to other places, where PlayStation isn't doing that they're doing just fine. But there's multiple reasons why, even though the console is selling extremely well, even though they're selling a ton of games, they're not making money. That if you look at the graph charts, they're selling a lot, but then the amount of costs and expenses they're having are almost the same. And so they're not making as much as they should be. Even though they're selling really well, their costs for making these games and these consoles are too great. And so I wanted to dive into this topic, and specifically why I think PlayStation is having this issue and what needs to change in order for them to start actually making money. And the reason why this is important is because if they don't make money, they're just going to make another PlayStation. But this thing isn't going to solve itself. I don't think people are seeing it fully of what's happening and what needs to change in the industry. And I see three different things that need to change if PlayStation wants to not just dive into the next cycle, and why things aren't really selling or making as much money as they were hoping for. So let's dive into it. So the first one, the most obvious one to me, is the cost of gaming currently and the current economic system. Now, hold on, you might not care, but this is actually really important. That since, 2020, the dollar all over the world is not worth what it once was. And people really feel the tension of just normal everyday life not being very affordable. And so during all of this, PlayStation releases a console that is way more expensive than it has been in the past. It's closer to the original PlayStation 3's kind of numbers for price, which was pretty hefty at the time, and eventually they went back on. And on top of that, games have now increased their price to add another $10, where games are now more expensive. That if you buy a game, it's almost $100, and that's pretty ridiculous. And so you have these increased price points during a time where the economy is struggling, where people feel like they don't have enough money. And so people aren't rushing out to buy these things because, to be honest, they can't just afford to drop $500 on a console, especially when a lot of the games are still releasing on the console they already have. And then on top of that, if they want to buy games for it, it's going to cost them more than it ever has previously. And so this is leading, in my opinion, to a downward spiral in sales, where sales are still good, but they're not as great because people can't honestly afford the prices they're setting these things at. On top of that, I think a lot of people were looking forward to a revision of the PlayStation 5 where it would become more affordable, and that didn't happen. The price even increased, and it's pretty bonkers. Especially because every time we have had a console revision, the price has gone down, and then more people are able to adopt the console and run out and buy it. That it drops by $50 or $100 sometimes, and people are able to go and get that console. But that did not happen with the PlayStation 5, that they released their revision and it was more expensive or the same price for even less stuff. Like, it doesn't even come with the stand, which is pretty wild. And so I think that that's leading to not as many people as they were expecting running out and buying this thing, is because, to be honest, most people are struggling just to live life, let alone be able to afford a luxury like having the latest console, especially when you can still play a lot of the games on the previous console. The second reason I think things aren't selling well is that games all are starting to feel the same. I felt this myself, but to get a unique experience from a game is difficult. That it really feels like there's a lot of formulas that are being formed in the Sony industry and in the industry in general. And games have a lot of love poured into them, but it does feel like they're formulaic. That I love PlayStation narrative-driven games. A lot of them feel the same in how they play. That to get that first experience of like a Last of Us, we're like, whoa, this is different, is extremely rare in PlayStation. God of War was different, but it was really like The Last of Us. It was different for what God of War was before. And on top of that, you've got games like Suicide Squad, which is obviously like a formulaic game. And a lot of game developers like Ubisoft and Call of Duty, they are now just kind of making games that feel like the other games that have come before. That innovation feels rare. And because of that, people aren't really picking up games. That if I already have a game that's kind of like the game you're making, I don't really feel like this urge to go out and play it. There doesn't feel like there's that many games being released that are like insanely groundbreaking that I must go out and buy and play and experience for myself. That those things feel really rarer than they used to be before. I feel like in the Xbox 360, PS3 area, there was a lot of games like that, and there was still a lot of experimentation and really cool experiences. And I would even argue same thing on the PS4 and the Xbox One, that I feel like that was the height of the golden era of gaming, and now we're kind of in a downward spiral of people finding out the formulas and what works and just kind of sticking to them, where a lot of games feel like pop music, where they're fine, they're great, they're enjoyable, but there's nothing really unique about it, and they all kind of sound the same. That's why I think not many people are running out to get the latest game, is because as much as I love Spider-Man 2, it really felt like Spider-Man 1, that there really wasn't anything new, and I really just wanted to see the story. That's why I purchased that game. Gameplay wise, it really wasn't that different, and so I feel like people aren't just rushing out to get those experiences, and the only reason they usually are just to avoid spoilers. But then lastly, and I think this is a really big issue, is that games are way too big now, that they take way too long to develop, and they are costing way too much money. I think that they need to pull back on the scope that they're putting into these games, because you can't make money if your game costs you $1 million to create. So for example, Spider-Man 2 sold insanely well, but the game cost $300 million to make. And so if you're spending that much money on a singular game, you have to sell so many units to make that profitable that it becomes a really difficult task. And I think that's one of the biggest issues here, is that PlayStation is making games that cost way too much money, that are way too long and padded, and they need to go back to the 15 to 25 hour game. That these massive open world games, with the amount of level of detail that modern gaming requires, for you to constantly be producing games that are kind of like that, with all these different side missions and whatever, that is going to make this game hard to actually make money. And especially when you look at the live service direction they were going in, that is also a very difficult market to break into. And you look at things like The Last of Us Online, think about how much time and money was spent on that just for it to be written off because it didn't work. And those are just the projects we're hearing about. And so they have this issue of games just being way too big and way too long and way too grand in scope, when they could trim down the fat a bit and actually be able to make more money. That you don't need to have that large of a budget to make a great game. For example, this is really similar in the movie industry. Right now, movies just spend oodles of money, bucket loads, to just get whatever they want in their movie. But the thing is, it doesn't always lead to better movies. Sometimes having those constraints leads to innovation, leads to things being done in a really cool way. That as great as Marvel movies were, that having endless amounts of budget doesn't always mean the movie is great. That sometimes having a movie that has a tight budget like Deadpool did it, and them having to work with that, creates innovative ideas and unique ways to tell stories. And I also think that for a lot of players, the games are too big where if you get several games in a year, you literally do not have enough time to finish those games. And I think players are kind of exhausted of that, where how can I buy a new game when I haven't even come close to beating the games I already own, especially when they cost this much. And so I think that if PlayStation wants to make more money and to become more financially stable, they need to pull back on the scope of their games, that they need to create really great experiences that are just a bit shorter. That I really think the PS3, Xbox 360 era, and even the PlayStation 4, Xbox One era before the end of its life cycle, that those kind of scope of games with better graphics and all the things modern hardware brings are a lot more feasible. And I actually think they're what players are looking for. I think players are no longer wanting these like massive games where every single game has an open world with a million side missions that are all honestly the same, and it makes everything kind of feel similar. I think they would rather have a shorter experience that's more polished, that trims the fat, makes it a bit better, and then on top of that, Sony can make more money. Now, with that being said, I don't think you can charge the prices you're charging for shorter games. Like you look at something like Miles Morales, that game was short and sweet. I really enjoyed that game. It had a lower price point, which was great, and they were able to make more money on it because it wasn't as big as something like a Spider-Man 2. I think experiences like that are just fine, that I don't think we need to have these massive games all the time. That I think for The Last of Us, that for them to make a Joel and Tommy game, that's like a 15-hour story. That's as long as The Last of Us Part 1 story was, and nobody felt like that was short. That if you really make a great story in that short of amount of time that's really linear, that people will love it and rush out to buy it. That The Last of Us Part 2 is a great example of a game that I love really deeply, but I'll be honest, the biggest downfall of the game is that it's too long. And even Naughty Dog themselves said in the documentary on the game that they felt like this game was too long, and the developers said, can we go back to when games were just like a little bit shorter? Like one of the developers literally said in the documentary, like, I'm like protesting and like taking a stand to move games back to being smaller stories, that they don't always have to be a 25-hour to 50-hour to 100-hour experience. And I think some of those games are great, but every game right now feels like they're trying to do that. And I just think that they can't. That if they want to make money, they need to lower those budgets, which means that they need to cut down how big these games are and how long they take to make, and how grand in scope they are, and make a really polished game that's just a little bit shorter and a little bit less open world with a million different side quests, something that's really polished. And I think that that would really help them go a long way. And so with that being said, I want to know what you guys think. So head down to the comment section down below. Let me know your thoughts. Why do you think Sony is having a hard time making money? Do you agree with me? And my three kind of main points is that the cost of things in recession. And then secondly, the games all kind of are feeling the same. And then thirdly, the games are just way too big for Sony to actually make money. And people don't really have an interest in buying new games when the games they already have, they're not even remotely close to beating. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Do you have other ideas? Let me know in the comment section down below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that junk, and I will see you guys in the next one.